Hi, everyone. Our presentation is on the high rates of mental illness among Native Americans and Indigenous folks in the U.S. I'm Bekah.
I'm Ajeeth.
And I'm Abby.
Next slide, please. All right, intro. So what is the problem? The problem is that Native Americans face higher rates of mental health disparities than other races. Who does the problem affect? The population that is affected includes American Indians, Inuit, and Alaskan Natives. Why should we learn about this? We should learn about this because Native Americans hold a special place in American history. It is important to learn about the mental health disparities so that we may improve this problem. So some facts about Native Americans. The death rates among young Native Americans ages 15 to 24 are higher than Caucasians within the same age group. It is also known that Native Americans are 5 times more likely to die of alcohol-related causes than Caucasians. Overall, many Native Americans reported that they felt unheard and trapped in a system of care where they have no control. Next slide, please. All right, so some background. It is important to understand where Native Americans are coming from and why their mental health is suffering. The history of Native Americans sets the stage for understanding their mental health needs. So prior to Western Europeans arriving in North America, Native Americans were self-governing people who thrived. But unfortunately, Native Americans were killed and forced onto reservations. In fact, Americans protested the destruction of entire Indian nations, which included tribes and tribal confederacies. The 1887 Dawes Severalty Act intended to integrate Native Americans into the rest of US society and had disastrous consequences. For example, Native Americans lost their surplus tribal lands and their allotted lands, which left little for their survival. So language is important when assessing the mental health needs of individuals. Approximately 280,000 Native Americans speak a language other than English at home. Consequently, evaluations of need for mental health care often have to be conducted in a language other than English. Even words such as depressed and anxious are absent from some Native American languages. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is a brief timeline to further demonstrate what Native Americans had to endure. It is estimated that a population of somewhere between 5 million and 15 million Native Americans in 1492 was reduced down to 237,000 by the 1800s, which is obviously a drastic change. And by the early 1900s, the population of Native Americans reached its lowest point at 5% of the original population, estimated after European contact. In the 1920s, the American Indian educational reform began, and in 1926, a public report called The Problem of Indian Administration concluded that the first and foremost need in education is a change in point of view. Whatever may have been the official government attitude, education for the Indian in the past has proceeded on the theory that it is necessary to remove the Indian child as far as possible from his home environment. In 1934, the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act placed great emphasis on civilizing Native people and teaching them Christianity. Native American children were sent to learn the American ways at boarding schools that were often thousands of miles from their home reservations. The National Resource Center on Child Sexual Abuse of 1990 found evidence that many Native American children were sexually abused while attending the boarding schools. Today, the Indigenous population of the US is at nearly 3 million, but they are still often seen as invisible people. Next slide, please. Limited access to healthcare. So according to the Brown et al. Article, a third of Native Americans do not have a usual source of healthcare. In 1955, the US government established the Indian Health Service, also known as the IHS, and their mission was to provide a comprehensive health service in order to meet the needs of Native Americans. However, the IHS clinics and hospitals are located mainly on reservations, giving only 20% of Native Americans access. In 1965, the first Office of Mental Health was opened on the Navajo Reservation and was severely understaffed and underfunded. Comprehensive mental health services for tribes has also been enacted and amended several times, but Congress has consistently failed to meet the funds to do so. Today, the IHS remains the primary organization responsible for the mental health care of Native Americans. Next slide, please. All right, so here is a direct quote from the Pedrati textbook. The racializing of Native peoples became the justification for slaughter, poisonings, crop destruction, war, and massacres, all for the sake of land. The same people who brought food to starving English settlers and taught them about crop rotation, fertilization, and weed management had a new identity constructed for them, the lazy savage. Imagine the cognitive dissonance produced by a human being brutalizing another, especially if that person had helped or saved you. In order to justify our treatment of Native Americans, Americans had to dehumanize them, make them into something else, the other. This text can be found on page 41 of the Pedrati textbook. Next slide, please.
The community it affects. So the topics we decided to choose for this slide were racism, discrimination, and stereotypes of said group, the cultural traditions, which we'll dive deeply into, as well as the health disparities, which is widely talked about in the news and media, and we decided to give it a little bit more coverage to dive deeper into it and give you all the facts. So this slide right here has a couple of illustrations, and these illustrations are representative of how Native American Indians are portrayed in today's culture in America, where on the left you see that there are costumes and outfits for Native American Indians, which range from hats and headwear to full body outfits. And in the middle, you see that they have Columbus Day parties, which is very controversial for many reasons, one of which being that this day seems to celebrate the destruction or the beginning of the destruction of Native American Indian culture versus celebrating the birth of a nation or the more positive connotation it may have. And while some people may see it as a celebration of America, others may see it as offensive. And instead of a celebration, they may view it as a cause for destruction of the Native American Indians of America. And on the top right, we have current mascots of sporting teams, which also have their own depth of controversy and have been requested to remove their mascots. However, many teams have refused to do this, and there's still ongoing debate with this. But the biggest question that arises from these three images is, how would you feel if your culture was being portrayed in this way? If your culture was being used to represent savagery for a football team or aggression, or if the destruction of your culture was being almost taken lightheartedly through parties and such. So one way in which racism, discrimination, and stereotypes of this group apply here is that the imagery and perception associated with Native American Indians are very important to this topic, and we need to delve deeper into how this imagery and perception does this and how we indeed see these images and these perceived notions of Native American Indians. And here's a quote from ferris.edu, which is a college website which encompasses a museum of Native American Indian culture. And essentially what it talks about here is, I'll let you read through it real quickly, but just to give you a brief overview of the quote, the Boston Tea Party, which helped spark the American Revolution, used Native American imagery. So you can see imagery dating back to pre-American Revolution times, and it was used to show this sort of wild, savage side, which maybe Euro-Americans felt uncomfortable displaying by themselves, but when they got into costume as Native American Indians, they maybe felt more comfortable, thus pushing this idea that Native Americans are a lot more savage than Euro-Americans, which is completely incorrect. And then the next slide, these are slightly longer quotes. If you don't have time to read them all, there's no worries at all. But according to ferris.edu, again, a great website and definitely a very interesting museum by the looks of it. But to dive deeper into the quote, another instance of imagery is being spoken about here, where the federal government uses these images, as well as the American military. And on top of that, we have companies that use Native American imagery, such as on tobacco products or on motorcycles, to kind of promote this idea of either authenticity or maybe even savagery in some areas. And in fact, it may be unethical to use these cultural traditions and cultural mascots based upon Native Americans, which is in fact inaccurate of their culture and is considered appropriating their culture by many. And here we have that the ongoing perception of Indians as dangerous contributes to negative expectations, interactions, and consequences. And this quote essentially illustrates the dangers of this portrayal of Native American culture by big-scale companies, corporations, and government or military. And here is a picture which I personally thought was absolutely breathtaking because of the idea it encompassed. And I mean, the horse looks amazing by itself, but the idea it encompasses is that Native American culture goes back further than just food and the way people interact with each other. It's the way they interact with nature. And they had a connection with many animals, one of which were horses, thus referred to as Horse Nation. And that's a culture that can't be seen as widely or prevalently today as it once would have been seen as. It's just one example of the culture that is now lost from Native American tradition. And cultural traditions, now to dive into this topic, this quote essentially illustrates how much of the population has been lost through disease and war, and this was touched upon earlier too. But just to kind of dive deeper into it one more time, many of the colonizers decided to, quote unquote, educate the Native Americans, or to the word used in this quote is Christianize Native people. And this happens, as is expressed in the quote, at the expense of their own cultures and languages, which means that for some reason it was okay to take someone else's culture and say that that was wrong and incorrect, and instead force upon your own culture onto them, thus causing them to lose their cultural traditions, And in many instances all across the world, culture is what drives health. And a lot of things that people do on a daily basis from morning to night, Monday to Friday, Monday to Sunday, is based upon their culture. And this helps keep them mentally healthy and fit. And when you lose that culture, it's a lot harder to remain healthy, which will lead us to the health disparities that we'll see in just a moment, which you probably have seen in the news already. And just to kind of touch upon the various topics that were changed by cultural traditions brought by Euro-Americans, were schooling, where the colonizing Americans decided to force Native Americans into schools and teach them their own set of quote unquote education standards. And on top of that, there were instances, I'd imagine instances of religion, where there was a lot of conflict based off religion, as well as the loss of tradition, which ties into to religion and schooling. And here is a quick chart, a small chart of the mortality rates and the discrepancies in Native American deaths from diseases of the heart is the first one. And then you have accidents as the third one, diabetes and alcohol-induced being up there. And this definitely illustrates a decline in the and the mental health aspect as well as the physical health aspect of Native Americans, which can only be tied back to the racism and discrimination as well as the loss in culture that they would have faced, which is touched upon in a later slide. And this quote essentially just illustrates that in a qualitative way, where Native American adults had one of the highest rates of mental illness compared to white, Black, Asian, and Hispanic adult populations, which just goes on to show how this group is almost such a small part of the United States now. However, they experience such a large part of the suffering that is encompassed in much of these statistics. And it seems to be almost incorrect factually to say that these Native Americans experience this much suffering and pain, when in reality, when you look at the data, that's what the qualitative and quantitative data show us. And then to top it all off, the health disparities can essentially be seen to be caused by the history of pain and suffering that comes with the loss of their culture and essentially a new change in their time, where colonizers came in and started directing what America should look like. And you can see this in racism, discrimination, and stereotypes, as well as a loss of tradition. And one of the final slides on these three topics of culture, health disparities, and racism is that another quote, which was expressed online, definitely illustrates this point in a different light. And it just shows us that the emotional psychological wounding of a people caused by past generations, and it shows that the history aspect of mental illness and physical illness almost ties in very deeply to what's happening right now. And the quote even goes on to talk about how there were definite deliberate eliminations of many cultural and spiritual practices, which was key to Native American health as well as happiness.
So how can we address this problem, and the problem being the high rates of mental illness we see among the Native American population? Obviously, we can't go back in time and change the loss of culture and the pain and suffering that this community has gone through in these communities, because they are more than one. But we can perform some tertiary prevention of mental health issues. So our idea is to create a 24-hour crisis hotline specifically for Native American individuals experiencing any sort of mental health crisis. As we know, there are other hotlines that exist, but this one would be specific to Native American populations. And the operators on this hotline would be trained to obviously counsel callers and provide these callers with outside resources that they could access outside of the hotline. But they should also be informed about the specific struggles and traumas experienced by Native Americans, and informed how Native American history might affect how Indigenous people are today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we decided to look into the efficacy of crisis hotlines and just crisis hotlines in general to see what would be most effective. And mental health issues are one of the leading issues people who call these crisis hotlines call for. And although hotline workers don't replace therapy, nor do they provide mental health diagnosis, they do provide an inexpensive, anonymous way for people in need to receive quality, brief intervention for mental health or other concerns. And therefore, they are a really good resource for marginalized populations that might have some lack of access to other forms of care and healthcare. And calling a hotline significantly decreases callers' crisis states and hopelessness, both during the call and in the weeks following. And this is due to the fact that most callers are also provided with referrals to other forms of mental health counseling. And in Califett et al., they discovered that on one crisis hotline, 1/3 of callers who were provided with referrals did follow through with them. While that would be better if it was 100%. It still is a significant amount. And by providing these referrals, hotlines can help people struggling with mental health concerns even after the call is over. So it is especially important that hotline counselors are well equipped and well trained to make these referrals and know these outside resources so that they can provide them to callers. However, there are barriers, of course, to accessing this continued help. A lack of insurance and callers' perceptions about mental health problems could be barriers to this. And this brings up some even bigger systemic issues that obviously were discussed previously, and proves that even though these hotlines are helpful, there needs to be way more structural change in time coming. Next slide, please. So in creating a hotline, it is very important that operators and counselors are trained to be aware of specific needs for Native Americans, since this hotline would be specific to Native American needs. So operators should go through in-depth training to make sure they are well equipped to offer these specific counseling resources and connect callers with any accessible resources. And they should be trained also how to handle issues related to substance abuse, since we see that this is a big problem in the Native American community, and people do need help for those problems. In addition, the number for the hotline should be advertised. Advertising the hotline is really important because people need to know about it for it to be effective, of course. And some ideas for this would be to create a website as well, and also have a texting option. And having a website and a texting option may make it easier for people who feel uncomfortable calling and talking about their issues, but it also might appeal to a younger demographic as well. And callers should also be allowed to be anonymous. Next slide, please. So our program evaluation plan starts with measuring engagement, and this would be keeping track of how many callers the hotline gets each day. Of course, if it's not getting enough calls, it's probably not getting enough engagement to be effective, and so that needs to be kept track of. Making sure operators and counselors record whether calls are successful or just recording calls in general. There needs to be some proof and way to keep track and see if callers follow through with their referrals as well. Also, a way to evaluate this program is to survey callers. So either by conducting surveys that callers can fill out and following up with callers after the calls. Of course, this would be limited to if these individuals wanted to conduct or be a part of surveys, because they should be allowed to be anonymous and their information should be allowed to be confidential. But by surveying callers, we could get their opinions and input, and they are the most important part of the call, so it would be helpful. And then also a more long-term measurement tool would be conducting follow-up studies in Native communities about mental health. This could be done years after the hotline is created, and we could see if it makes any impact at all in the bigger situation and the bigger problem. Next slide.
So in conclusion, Native Americans experience greater psychological distress than the overall population. Secondly, attempts to eradicate Native culture have been associated with negative mental health consequences. Thirdly, Native Americans comprise such a small percentage of the US population. Representative studies do not generate sufficiently large samples of this special population to draw accurate conclusions regarding mental health care. Furthermore, evaluating the need for mental health care among Native Americans requires careful clinical study that attends closely to culture. To improve this problem, create a 24-hour crisis hotline specifically for Native American individuals experiencing any sort of mental health crisis. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's do a mental exercise directly from the textbook. I want you to picture a Native American person in your head, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to think of someone in particular. Next slide, please. So who did you think of? Being very honest, how stereotypic was this picture in your head? Did you picture someone who is not Native American but played a Native American? Did you think of someone from the past like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, or Sacagawea? Did you think of Pocahontas or a mascot from a sports team or Jacob from Twilight? Due to the fact that Native Americans make up less than 1% of the US population today, these images likely occur more quickly to an average non-Native American person in the US than images of actual Native Americans. Playing Native American cuts across race, class, gender, age, and group affiliations. Some people engage in such play temporarily, such as Halloween costumes, and others appropriate Indian names and identities on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. So that leads us to our discussion questions. The first question is, who did you think of when you pictured a Native American in your head during our mental exercise? The second question is using the depiction of Native American for a sport mascot or dressing up as a Native American for an event acceptable? And the last question is, aside from creating a hotline, how can we improve the mental health of Native Americans? We would love to hear your thoughts on these questions. Next slide, please. And last but not least, here are our citations. We really appreciate you viewing our presentation, and thank you.